Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, getting updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at the two advisories that we have out for the state. We do have two more frost advisories out for tonight for the Yakutat area and for the Haines area. Now I want to be clear with these that near the water it's going to stay warm enough where we don't have the frost advisory out for both of these locations. So we're specifically targeting Hoonah and back Mendenhall Valley for those areas around Yakutat. And near Haines we're targeting the highway up closer towards the border. And these are both going to be in effect from 1 a.m. to 8 a.m. on Tuesday. We also have up north, out over the Norton Sound area, elevated water levels for the west coast. Now, at present we're not forecasting these to hit advisory level, but they will be 1 to 3 feet above normal high tide across much of the coastline in the area highlighted here, which is from the Yukon Delta area through Norton Sound and up towards the Bering Strait area to include Nome. So again, these are going to have water levels rising 1 to 3 feet above normal high tide, and that's going to be Tuesday night through Wednesday morning. We could also see some winds out of a south to southwest direction at 25 to 35 miles per hour across many of these same locations along much of the west coast, as we have a low pressure system moving up into the area through the eastern portions of the Bering Sea. We will encourage residents to move possessions well above the normal high tide line. Again, this is Tuesday night to Wednesday morning where we'll have some higher water levels 1 to 3 feet above normal high tide. Looking at our satellite imagery, we have a low pressure system out over the far western portions of the Bering Sea. This one's been relatively stationary as it has since occluded and started to fill in now, still bringing some showers to areas of the western Bering and down into the Aleutian Islands as well. We also have a low moving up through the eastern portions of the Bering Sea near the Pribilof Islands as we look at the last image of this satellite loop, and that's pushing a front closer towards the southwestern portions of the state, and we can watch this as the front moves in from the eastern Aleutian Islands out towards the Alaska Peninsula area, bringing cloud cover and rain to these areas. Then as we watch this loop again, we can see a lot of the cloud cover out ahead of this system pushing in over much of the west coast and much of mainland Alaska. A lot of that cloud cover over those eastern portions is going to be higher cloud cover, whereas as we get closer towards the west coast, we'll have a lot of lower clouds and precipitation with this area. We have high pressure out over the Gulf of Alaska area that's keeping a lot of southeastern portions of the state clear and dry. However, we do have a lot of that cloud cover pushing in towards the middle parts of this ridging out over mainland Alaska. We have our frontal system that's moving in through the Alaska Peninsula, pulling in that warmer air from the south, bringing rain to the Alaska Peninsula area and much up the west coast of the state as well, where we'll start to see a mix of rain and fog as we get closer towards the Norton Sound area and up through the Kotzebue Sound area. Then continued fog up along the Arctic coastline with some patchy areas of rain mixed in. We also have some of that rain pushing a little bit more into the interior, past the Galena area, towards the central portions of the interior. But as we get to eastern interior down through south central Alaska, expecting conditions to remain dry for the remainder of today. Way out west, we have a low pressure system out over the western Bering Sea, where we're going to see some showers from that through much of the Bering down into the Aleutian Islands as well. As we look into tonight, that low is going to stay relatively stationary, slowly starting to make its way to the south, continuing to bring rain showers to the western and central Aleutian Islands and western and central Bering as well. Our old frontal system now pushing in a little bit more inland over southwest Alaska and through the Norton Sound area, bringing more rain to these areas, and down into the Alaska Peninsula where we have another low forming off of the old boundary, continuing to bring more warm air up from the south, starting to make it closer towards the Kodiak Island area. As our high pressure ridging has pushed off a little bit to the east, we have allowed some more of the rain to push a little bit further in towards the central portions of mainland Alaska, getting into some of the western Alaska range and some of the western interior as well. where we'll start to see a mix of rain and fog in the Norton Sound area up through the Point Hope area, and then we'll have some fog up along the Arctic coastline. Down through the eastern portions of the mainland, down through South Central, and through the Panhandle area, we're expecting conditions to stay dry tonight. Then as we move into Tuesday, the high pressure is starting to weaken, and we have some high lingering out over the Gulf of Alaska, extending in over the Panhandle area, keeping that area dry on Tuesday. But our front is now pushing further to the east, bringing some rain to the Kenai Peninsula and Kodiak Island, up through much of the western portions of mainland Alaska, as well as central locations, to include the Susitna Valley and the western Alaska Range, where we'll see some snow at the higher elevations, as well as some snow in the central portions of the Brooks Range at higher elevations as well. Rain will start to make its way into the central interior and continue to be all along the west coast of the state, where we'll once again have a mix of rain and fog in the Norton Sound and up through the west coast into the Point Hope area, where we'll have more fog along the Arctic coastline as well. Down in the Bering Sea, our low pressure is slowly pushing off to the southeast, where we'll have some continued rain showers out through much of the southern Bering and throughout all of the Aleutian Islands. This does include the Pribilof Islands as well. As we move into Wednesday, that low will have moved off to the east, closer towards the Alaska Peninsula, as another low is coming up from the North Pacific towards the Alaska Peninsula, bringing another round of rain and warm air to areas all throughout the southern mainland, to include the Kodiak Island, some rain into much of south central Alaska, down through the Alaska Peninsula, and throughout all of southwest Alaska. There'll be some lingering rain from the southerly flow out over the remainder of the mainland, especially along the west coast, with some areas of snow in the higher elevations of the Brooks Range and some more steady rain along the Arctic coastline. Down in the Panhandle area, our high pressure is still barely holding on there, enough to keep the Panhandle dry through Wednesday. And then way out west, out over the Aleutian Islands and Bering Sea, the westerly flow is going to bring some continued showers to the area, with some lighter showers for the Aleutian Islands and into the Bering. As we look at our low temperatures for Tuesday morning, starting out over the Aleutian Islands, temperatures dropping down into the mid-40s, with 45 for Atka, Adak, and Unalaska, as well as 46 degrees for that low for St. Paul. Down in the Bristol Bay area, temperatures dropping down into the lower 50s, 51 for Iliamna, King Salmon, and Dillingham. And then as we move up into southwest, the remainder of southwest Alaska, temperatures dropping down into the mid to upper 40s. A little bit warmer at Aniak, dropping down to 50 degrees there. Stretching up the west coast of the state into the mid to upper 40s as well for the Seward Peninsula and Nome at 48 degrees. Kotzebue is going to be 45. And then as we move to the Arctic coastline, temperatures dropping down into the 30s, colder as we get off to the east, with Deadhorse and Kaktovik both dropping down to 33 degrees. Coldest in the state, however, is going to be at Arctic Village, dropping down to 29. And then we'll see a trend where the eastern locations are going to be colder than those off to the west, as we have that frontal system bringing up some of the warm air for those western locations. We'll have places like Fort Yukon dropping down to 35 degrees, and near freezing for places like Northway. Down in the south central area, we're going to have temperatures dropping down into the lower to mid 40s. A little bit colder there in the Copper River Basin. Places like Glen Allen could drop down till near freezing. And we also have at Kodiak City 48 degrees for that expected low. And then down in the Panhandle area, temperatures dropping down into the 40s for the most part, warmer as we get further to the south, and then cooler as we get closer towards the Yakutat area, 33 degrees expected low for Yakutat. Looking into Tuesday afternoon highs, temperatures in the Panhandle area getting back up into the 60s, warmest as we get further to the south, upper 60s there, and then lower 60s as we get further to the north. In the south central area, temperatures getting up into the mid to upper 50s, warmer in the Copper River Basin, Glen Allen getting up to 61 degrees. In the interior, temperatures going to get up into the 50s for most locations of the interior. However, some of those central locations like Fairbanks are going to get up into the lower 60s. Then as we move up along the Arctic coastline, temperatures getting up into the 40s, with the exception of Kaktovik staying at 38 degrees. Along much of the west coast near 50 degrees until we get to southwest Alaska, where we'll see some mid-50s. Mid-50s continuing down the Alaska Peninsula, and lower to mid-50s for the Aleutian Islands. Temperatures for Wednesday morning dropping back down into the 40s for the Aleutians as well as the Alaska Peninsula. Much of the western half of the state going to be in the lower to mid 40s, with lower 40s continuing for much of the interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, we'll see temperatures drop down into the 30s for the central and eastern locations, but staying in the 40s out west. Down in the south central area, temperatures dropping down into the 40s as well. Kenai getting down to 44 degrees. And then temperatures in the Copper River Basin again dropping down into the 30s. Down in the Panhandle, we're going to see temperatures drop into the 40s for the most part. Some of the northerly locations could still get down into the 30s, but warmer as we get further to the south and out near the Gulf of Alaska. Temperatures for Wednesday afternoon in the Panhandle getting up into the mid-50s in northern locations, mid-60s in the southern locations. South central Alaska getting up into the mid to upper 50s, with Kodiak getting up to 58 degrees, mid-50s for much of the interior, and that's going to extend down into southwest Alaska as well, near 50 for the Seward Peninsula, and mid-40s for much of the Arctic coastline. Down in the Alaska Peninsula, temperatures getting up into the mid-50s and lower 50s for much of the Aleutian Islands, with 54 degrees expected for St. Paul.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Tuesday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread IFR and MVFR conditions are expected, with a lot of those conditions making it into southwest Alaska, pushing in especially along the coastline where we have a lot of IFR conditions expected. That's going to extend down to the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island as well. Up through the Brooks Range, we're seeing some areas of MVFR and IFR, and that's going to be true along the Arctic coastline as well. However, much of the interior and the majority of south central Alaska should be VFR Tuesday morning, as well as down in the Panhandle. Let's move into Tuesday afternoon. Going to see VFR conditions continuing in the Panhandle area, as well as much of south central and much of the interior. However, some of those MVFR conditions will have snuck into southern portions of the Kenai Peninsula, as well as remaining along much of the west coast to include much of the western Alaska Range and much of the Brooks Range. Some MVFR conditions are still going to linger right along the coastline of the Arctic coast, and then the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands will see primarily MVFR conditions. As we look into Wednesday morning, continuing to see MVFR for the Bering and Aleutian Islands as well as the Alaska Peninsula, we'll see continued MVFR conditions progressing further into south central Alaska as well as remaining along southwest Alaska and much of the west coast and western interior. There will be some spotty areas of IFR within these MVFR conditions. Up through the Brooks Range, primarily IFR conditions are expected, and then MVFR and IFR along the Arctic coastline up north. Down in the Panhandle area, expecting to continue to see VFR conditions. And then on Wednesday afternoon, VFR conditions continuing for the Panhandle as well. Through mainland Alaska on Wednesday afternoon, you see a lot of areas of MVFR, especially as we get along the west coast and areas up by the Brooks Range, with some areas in south central Alaska low-lying areas going to see more VFR conditions, as well as some of the areas in the interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, primarily VFR conditions until we get out to the west, where we'll see some more marginal conditions. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, primarily MVFR conditions, as well as at the Alaska Peninsula. Taking a look at our passes, AKwx should be MVFR throughout the day Tuesday, as well as at Adigan Pass. Lake Clark will start off and stay IFR throughout the day, where Merrill will start off VFR and then drop down to IFR in the afternoon. Rainy Pass will start off VFR, drop down to marginal conditions. However, Windy Pass will stay VFR throughout the day. Isabel Pass also expected to be VFR all day on Tuesday, as well as at Mentasta Pass, and Tanita also going to be VFR. Portage will start off VFR and then drop down to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Chilkoot and White should both be VFR throughout the day on Tuesday. Taking a look at our freezing levels, we have some of the colder air coming down out over the Bering Sea with freezing levels down to as low as 4,000 feet by the Pribilof Islands, and then some warmer air coming up from or into the Gulf of Alaska, bringing some freezing levels up to as high as 12,000 feet in the central Gulf. As we look at our icing out over the western Aleutian Islands, extending out by or through much of the Bering Sea and to the eastern Aleutian Islands, above 5,000 feet is expected, above 7,000 feet over southwest Alaska, increasing in height to above 8,000 feet over the northwestern portions of the state. And as we get by the eastern Brooks Range, still going to be above 8,000 feet there. Looking at our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet is just to the south of the Alaska Peninsula out of a westerly direction, 115 knots. Moving over southwest Alaska out of a southerly direction, 105 knots. And then exiting out over northwest Canada up to as high as 110 knots out of a northwesterly direction. Down to 9,000 feet, starting out west by our low pressure out over the western Bering. Northerly winds 35 knots expected over the area. Becoming westerly about 30 knots for the remainder of the Aleutian Islands. Then southwest flow over much of the state. Strongest winds are going to be by Kodiak Island around 50 knots, dropping down to 45 knots for the western Alaska Range. Southwesterly winds 35 knots by the Norton Sound, and southerly winds 30 knots as we get up by the Point Hope area. Little weaker winds along the Arctic coastline and down by the Panhandle. Down to 3,000 feet, with our high pressure out over the Gulf, still seeing weaker winds over the Panhandle area. Our strongest winds are going to be around our low by St. Lawrence Island. Our westerly winds to the south of the low, 50 knots are expected, and southerly winds over much of the western portions of the state, around 45 knots there. Southwesterly winds 40 knots by Kodiak Island. Up along the Arctic coastline, a little bit weaker, and southeasterly, 30 knots are expected, diminishing in speed as we move further to the east. Then out over the Aleutian Islands, we're going to have primarily westerly winds, a little bit more northerly by the western Aleutians, 40 knots expected there, then dropping down to around 25 knots out of the westerly direction for the central and eastern Aleutians. So look at our turbulence. With those stronger winds over the western portion of the state, we do have a fair amount of turbulence out west, below 5,000 feet by the Kodiak Island area, extending up through southwest Alaska, below 4,000 feet by Kotzebue Sound, below 6,000 feet through the passes of the Alaska Range, and below 3,000 feet for the western Aleutians.
Hello again, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service with another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. And joining me today are not just one, but two people, both with the last name Stevens, which is even more fun, but no relation. We have Eric Stevens from Dehne and George Stevens, who is a mechanical engineering student from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Did I get that right?
Yep.
Awesome. And today you guys brought a really cool toy, or I should say tool, with you. It's a sandbox, but why are you guys working on a sandbox?
Well, it's part of our senior design project, and we were approached by AKwx to build this for them. They had a proof of concept that they developed about a year ago, I think, and they wanted a more robust version that they could pack onto a plane and take places, and it's a handy learning tool for kids and adults.
So you're a mechanical engineering student. You've built a traveling sandbox for the experimental program to stimulate competitive research, EPSCoR, and Dehne's facilitated this. But why do we need a traveling sandbox?
Well, the prototype was such a big hit that they decided they wanted another one, actually two, that that would be easier to travel with, you know, possibly marketable even.
Okay, so this is a traveling sandbox that's got a lot of bits and pieces and a computer hooked up to it. What is the computer doing with the sand?
The computer actually uses a Kinect sensor to read the topography of the sand or the shape of the sand, and then the computer translates that into information which it projects using a projector onto the sand, showing topographical lines and which is representative of the shape of the sand.
Okay, so this is a live mapping tool?
Yeah. It's interactive. As you're moving your hands through it, it is actively following and changing the lines to fit what you're doing.
That sounds like something I could have in my backyard.
Yep.
It'd be a lot of fun. So you guys had to change the design a little bit to make this more Alaska-fied, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, how'd you do that?
Well, the original was made out of basically lumber and Simpson strong tie type stuff, and we rebuilt it to make it lighter and basically more transportable. We can pack it down to a fairly small size, and it can be loaded onto a plane and flown anywhere in the state. Which
you guys did today. And you have plans to take this in other places of Alaska, right?
Yep, we're actually going to be headed down to Homer with it later today.
Okay, very good. Eric, how does this fit into science learning around Alaska?
Well, you know what? I think it is a tool and it is a toy. And it brings out a smile from an 8-year-old and the smile from a 48-year-old with that inner 8-year-old wanting to get out. The sandbox, it's an interactive learning tool that teaches us how topography in the 3 dimensions is related to, say, a 2-dimensional map. More about that later. Just like George was saying, it's got a Kinect sensor, not just for video games anymore. It can sense out the lay of the land there, feeds that information in the computer identifies that, sends a signal to a projector to send topographic lines to map over that lumpy ground. So you get a 3-dimensional topo map out of it. And my favorite thing about it, this is the thing that stops people at the trade show, they stop at your booth and don't leave, is that you run your hand through that sandbox and it responds in real time. It remaps the topography as you get to be Mr. Tectonic Plate Drifter there. You can make things how you want. Well, what if we made a really high mountain here and a low valley there, and the lines adjust to what you did, it's a learning tool because it shows you that connection between these two-dimensional topo lines and what's really out in Alaska. And Alaska's a place with all kinds of topography. You know, we're from the Great Plains, where topo maps tend to be just like blank pieces of paper, but Alaska is particularly gifted in this regard, and this tool helps us, I think, learn more about our state, really.
Absolutely. And so this is going to enhance STEM learning, the science, technology, engineering, and math, in many different locations around Alaska. Then this would be something that kids and teachers can get their hands on.
It sure is. And I mentioned the it's like flypaper at a booth that, or at the Science Potpourri when we had Greg's original version of this sandbox, and that one was made out of scraps of wood, and it was a prototype. But even that one, before it had some of the refinements that George and crew have made for this newer, upscaled, maybe a 2.0 version of the sandbox, even that one was so attractive to people. It just demonstrated that this has potential to be a learning tool, an outreach tool, an education tool that now is portable and can go places in Alaska. Of course, there's only one sandbox, can't be everywhere at once, but hopefully it gets out there, gets the word out about EPSCoR and what science is being done here for Alaskans.
All right, that sounds really interesting, and I can't wait to get my hands in the sand and try this out for myself. We're going to demonstrate this here in our next segment of Alaska Weather Facts, but before we go, we want to remind you that EPSCoR, which is a new acronym for me now, but I'm going to remember this because you can follow them on Facebook and Twitter, and I invite you to do that. Alaska EPSCoR is also something that facilitates science learning at the University of Alaska around the state, and that stands for Experimental Program to Stimulate Competitive Research. So check that out and make sure you tune in tomorrow because we're going to have the next version where we actually get our hands in the sand and check out how this works and demonstrates that topography. So for now, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with this edition of Alaska Weather Facts, and we'll see you again next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section. We'll start off with a quick look at our ice edge. Not a lot has changed in terms of the pack ice, and we still have our navigation waters are clear of ice for now. Then for Tuesday's forecast for southeast Alaska and the inside waters up by Lynn Canal area, we have southerly winds 15 knots, becoming more northerly as we drift further to the south, still around 15 knots. Out over the eastern Gulf, northerly winds 15 knots, and as we move up into the northern Gulf, westerly winds 10 knots. Seas up to as high as 4 feet in the eastern Gulf of Alaska. Then on Wednesday in the inside water, southeasterly winds 10 knots for most locations. In Lynn Canal, we're going to see southerly winds up to as high as 15 knots. Out over the eastern Gulf, northerly winds 10 knots, and becoming south to southeast winds 15 knots in the northern portions of the Gulf. For Tuesday for south central Alaska, out over the Gulf waters, east to southeast winds 10 knots in northern areas up to as high as 25 knots as we get closer towards the Barren Islands. Our southeasterly winds 10 knots in Prince William Sound. Through the Cook Inlet areas, southeasterly winds 10 knots up north, 25 knots, southern Cook Inlet up to as high as 30 knots west of the Barren Islands. Seas up to as high as 8 feet, highest west of the Barren Islands. Then on Wednesday in the Cook Inlet area, north to northeast winds 15 knots. That's going to extend down into the Kamishak Bay area as well. And then out over the Gulf waters, we have southeasterly winds 15 knots in northern locations, easterly winds 10 to 20 knots as we get into the western locations. Out over Prince William Sound, northeasterly winds 15 knots are expected. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island area on Tuesday, you can actually see some of the circulation around our low pressure system near Kodiak Island, where we have southeasterly winds at 25 knots for Shelikof Strait, southerly winds to the to the east of the island at 25 knots, and southwesterly winds south of the island 30 knots. Then we're going to see west to southwest winds as we push off further to the west, 15 to 20 knots are expected, with seas up to as high as 9 feet south of Kodiak Island. Then on Wednesday, flow becoming east to southeast at all locations. Weakest near Kodiak Island, 10 knots expected, getting up to as high as 20 to 25 knots as we move further to the west. For Tuesday for the Aleutian Islands, southwesterly winds for most locations, 20 knots for the central and eastern Aleutian Islands, up to as high as 25 to 30 knots as we get by the western Aleutians. Seas higher out there as well, up to as high as 10 feet. On Wednesday, flow for all areas west to southwest, 20 to 25 knots, with the exception of the area north of the eastern Aleutians, up to as high as 15 knots there. Seas up to as high as 11 feet, highest south of the central Aleutians. Up along the west coast of the state, southwesterly winds 20 knots south of Nunavik Island, getting up to 30 knots north of the island, 25 knots out of a southerly direction for Norton Sound, and southwesterly winds 30 knots for St. Matthew Island, southwesterly winds 20 knots for the Pribilof Islands. As we move into Wednesday, all along the west coast, southerly winds 20 knots in Norton Sound area, 25 knots near St. Lawrence Island, and 15 to 20 knots near Nunavik Island. Out by St. Matthew Island, southwesterly winds 20 knots are expected, and southerly winds 15 knots for the Pribilof Islands. Up along the Arctic coastline, easterly winds are expected 25 to 30 knots. That's going to continue down much of the west coast as well until we get near the Bering Strait area, where we'll start to see southwesterly winds of 25 knots, seas up to as high as 9 feet south of the strait. On Wednesday, flow along the west coast out of the south 20 to 25 knots, becoming easterly 20 to 25 knots along the Arctic coastline. Recap of our weather for tonight. We have a relatively stationary low out over the western portion of the Bering Sea that's very slowly moving to the south and east. That's going to bring some showers out through the central and western portion of the Bering and Aleutian Islands. Our frontal system is pushing into the western portions of the state, starting to move through southwest Alaska, bringing rain all the way up the west coast towards the Point Hope area and into much of the western portions of the interior and southwest Alaska. It's also going to be a mix of rain and fog from the Norton Sound area through Point Hope, with areas of fog up along the Arctic coastline. A low is forming off of the old boundary near the Alaska Peninsula area that's going to bring some rain to Kodiak Island and to the Alaska Peninsula itself. But high pressure is dominating much of the Gulf of Alaska, extending up over northeastern Canada, allowing for drier conditions for the eastern interior, south central Alaska, and the Panhandle. As we move into Tuesday, that high pressure is going to drift off over eastern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, still keeping areas of the Panhandle dry, as well as some areas in the eastern portions of the interior and eastern south central. But our front is going to start to make its way further to the east as that high pressure starts to weaken, allowing for rain to push into the Kenai Peninsula area, Susitna Valley, all the way up the west coast and western interior, with areas of fog through the Norton Sound area up along the Arctic coastline, and then some isolated showers throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.